So we're here on page Vav, and we began, but we didn't really get into the issue of Bechor and Mas. And then we'll have an issue about Pesach. Now, the laws of Bechor and Maser are a little bit unique in the constellation of Kodshim, and whenever you have an exceptional carbon, you have to know how that kicks in the case of a Tmura. So, for example, in Tmura, we say that the Behemoth Kodshim that you a Meimir now needs to be brought on the Mizbech. But the exceptions to those rules are Bechor and Maser, where the Tmura is Kadosh b'Kedushas Bechor or Kedushas Maser, but it is not brought on the Mizbech. Ella Mamtin ad she'yipol bo mum. This is what we call Yirat she'istayv, which we mentioned yesterday. That means you let the animal go out to pasture until it swallows a nail or something like that and gets a mum. And then tochal b'muma kidin b'char u'maser shehun. Now, what's unique about Bechor and Maser is that Bechor and Maser have an extra element of Dinei Momenos to them. And that means that if the Kedusha is Batel, then it has a din of Necha. We shecht it and we eat it. Now, we have a status of a Bechor through Tmura, but now we don't bring the Bechor on the Mizbech. So what option do we have? So sometimes we just let the animal die, like in the case of Chatos V'Yasham, right? We said that Tmuras Chatos is one of the 5 categories of Chatos HaMesas, and we let the animal die. But in the cases of Bechor and Maser, if you have a Tmuras Bechor, a Tmuras Maser, then what we're going to do is we're going to wait until it has a mum. And in the law of Bechor and Maser, once it has a mum, then instead of doing a pigeon on it, which we do in other karbonos that become bali mum, like let's say, for example, if a carbon asham becomes a bal mum, right? Let's say you send it out to pasture and it swallows a nail and it gets a puncture to one of its internal vital organs, then what you do is you do a pigeon on it. And that's called Psuli HaMikdashim, where once it's excluded from the Mizbeach, now we can do a pigeon. And we take the money of that pigeon and we use it to buy another carbon asham. But in the cases of Bechor and Maser, the halacha of Psuli HaMikdashim, if it becomes a Balmum, is a whole different set of halachas. There's no pigeon, you just simply shecht it and eat it. The question is going to be whether you have to, let's say in the case of Bechor, whether or not, let me just see in the footnote here, he says, Beis, Mishnah Chaf Aleph. So this is based on a Mishnah in Tmura. We should really always have at least the Kahati Mishnah in front of us. You have such a thing? No. All right, so take a look in the Mishnah itself on Daf Chaf Aleph. And then he says, Ukfar Tomu Ravim al Divrei Atosus Yontif, Shetmuras Habachar Kreva. Somehow the Tosus Yontif seems to be unaware of a Mishnah. His name was Heller, Yontif Heller. He lived about 3 centuries ago. And he has a super commentary on Mishnah. It's called the Tosus Yontif. And somehow he seems to be oblivious to this Mishnah in Tmura, and he assumes that Tmuras Bechor, like any other Tmura, is brought on the Mizbeach. That's what he points out here in the footnote. But we know from the Mishnah that Tmuras Bechor ain't a kreva. You find that Mishnah? Chaf Aleph?
Right.
If you don't find the Mishnah, then it could be a misprint here now. You do find a Mishnah. You want to either read it in Hebrew or in English, whatever you're more comfortable with.
With regard to Mura, the firstborn, the tithe, their offspring, are like the original firstborn. firstborn and they are eaten in their blemished state by
Eaten in the blemished state by their owners. And he's referring to both Bechar and Meiser. But Meiser he calls it tithe.
Yeah.
Okay, I've heard that in the past. And Bechar he calls it firstborn. And he says that they're eaten in their blemished state. That's it. Any footnotes or any that he should give you a little bit more background in the
or mice are automatically consecrated when it's blemish.
So stop there. Wait a second. Hold on a second. Before you read, before you go on, I just want to add the following comment that in the case of Psuli HaMikdashim, as a universal rule, with the exceptions of Bechor and Maser, the Kedusha is still there. It's not Royal Mizbeach, and it goes down a level, but let's say, for example, you might have an Isur Me'ilo or Gizav Avoda. It might be a whole list of Isurim, which you have to remove through Pidyon. The Chiddush of Bechor and Maser is that the entire carbon exhausts itself in Mizbeach, meaning as long as it's Royal Mizbeach, it's a Tam, then it's a Bechor, it's a Maser. The very moment it becomes excluded from the Mizbeach, its whole raison d'etre, its whole the purpose of existence is gone. And there's no need for pidyon, just shecht it and eat it. Okay, now read the footnote. It should be more meaningful.
Right.
We're going to see something very similar by a Korban Pesach.
Right.
Go ahead.
Maser are automatically deconsecrated when it's blemish, no redemption needed.
Oh, no redemption is needed. He calls it deconsecrated. In our language, we call it hafkas shem carbon. In other words, it's no longer a carbon if it's not royal in his bag. That I would go a step further. It's not only hafkas shem carbon, it's hafkas kedushas hegdish, and therefore it's chulin. You could check it and eat it.
What color is a mice?
Chor and mas.
What's mice?
Ma'aser means if you have 10 animals in your corral, then you count, and after the 10th goes out, you give it a red stripe and you call asirei kodesh.
That you have to take.
And that has to be brought on the mizbeach. It has kedushas carbon. It's maser. It's very similar to. It's not exactly a shlomim because it has dinim that deviate from a class. But yeah, it's pretty similar to. I mean, like we're going to talk about Korban Pesach. Is that a shlomim or not? I mean, there's so many complicated dinim in a Pesach. Anything left to that footnote, or that's the end?
I mean, it's saying the same would apply to the more of the core.
And what then
once it has a boom, then it's consecrated.
And then he slaughters it and eats it.
Actually, it's more.
Bechor and Maser are always grouped together. I mean, I think the Gemara in Tzvachim questions that, but there is a Gzeira Shav between Bechor and Maser that gives you almost a carte blanche to make a mirror image and apply all the dinim of this one to this one. The Gemara goes back and forth. There's certain dinim in Bechor, and now we apply them to Maser, certain dinim in Maser. Now we're going to apply them to the Bechor. Here's one case in which, by the way, I guess you'd have to learn the sugya there to figure out how the Gemara substantiates the Mishnah that in the case of Tmuras Bechor or Tmuras Maser, the Torah says that it's not Karev al Gabi Mizbeach. You want to give me the Gemara? Maybe I'll just, again, I don't, this is already going way beyond.
So we're not talking about
No, they don't have a right? Because the original Tvura, right? Tvura always comes from Bema Haru'uyel Mizbeach, and then you clone it, as we said, onto the Bema Schulin. Now the Bema Schulin becomes Bechor through Tvura or Maser through Tvura, and now the question is, can we bring it on the Mizbeach? The Gemara is telling us, based on Sam Yalfusa, that this is an exception to the case, that there's no Tvura. I was wondering if by chance you can see It seems like the Gemara is going to assume that Puras or Masa is not Kodesh and Mizbeach. But the Gemara wants to know: Are you allowed to deliberately make a blemish? Me, I'm reading Kevin the Lav Kriven Lo Machayim. That's normally there's a lav in the Torah that prohibits you from making a move in an animal that's royal mizbeach. And if you violate that lav, you get malchus for it. Does that apply to a bechar or a maser that was tmura? Because since it's not royal mizbeach, perhaps it's not included under the Isser of making it into a balm.
If it's not there to make smaller, then why is it hektish? Can't be hektish. Can't be smaller.
Well, it's kodesh b'kedushas tmura. That itself is a category of tmura, but in this category of tmura, it's tmura minus mizbeach. Very strange.
So it's still like hektish.
So the Gemara wants to suggest that its status of a hekdesh generates an isa to actively create a move, because if you actively create a move in a behemoth hekdesh, you violate a lav get balkus. But the Gemara is saying, "Oh, Dilma, maybe kaven to lo krivu lo machayev." You know, when the Torah prohibits you from making a move, it's because you're excluding something that's royal in mizbeach, and you make it not royal in mizbeach. Oh, Dilma, should we say no? Kaven to Kodshim, since the Tmura is effective to at least to generate a kedusha, so we take the kedusha from a bechar and maser, and now we clone it onto this behemas chulin. Now the iser of being matil move the behemas kodshim applies. So that's the Gemara vacillates about this. But what I don't know is, how do we derive the conclusion that Uras, Bechar, and Mas, again, it's explicit in the Mishnah, but how did the Mishnah know that there is no Tmura? Chutz min ha-Bechar va-Maser, the Mishnah does not mean that they are offered on the altar like the original Bechar or the original Maser. For in fact, the Tmura of Bechar and Maser may not be offered. And the Gemara derives this law exegetically. And he tells you to look on Daf Yud Zayin. He doesn't tell you exactly what the drasha is, but this is drasha. Instead of being offered on the Mizbeach, these substitutes, he gives an English word for Tmura, I never saw that before, substitutes, are left to graze until they develop a blemish. Again, the Gemara offers the possibility that you're allowed to actively take a knife and cut under the ear. You remember the Gemara Gittin about the Churban Beis HaMikdash. The Mishnah means that the Tmura possesses the sanctity of the original Bechar or Meiser offering. Just as it is forbidden to sell Bechar and Meiser offerings in the public market until they become blemished, so too is forbidden to sell their substitutes, again, Tmura, in the public market. Okay. All right. So I'll just put it here. This requires, obviously, like everything we're doing, we're just trying to get get the this. Okay, let me just give you this. Okay, let's go on to a machlokas rishonim in Tmuras Bechar Shel Yisrael nitenes lekohen idin Bechar atzmo o shenecholim lebailim hayisrael nechelis lebailim hayisrael. Okay. So now we have an interesting machlokas rishonim So 1 second, I just have to calculate, is this before the mum or after the mum? Just 1 second. Tmuras bechor shel Yisrael. Right. You remember I mentioned to you when we started, just a few minutes ago, that what's unique about these karbonos is that there's an element of a chiyuv mama. And it's not just a question of bringing it on the mizbeach, but it's also a gift. For example, let's say they take the bechor. The bechor has to be given to the kohen. But now you have something called a tmuras bechor. And a tmuras bechor has the kedusha of a bechor. It cannot be brought on the mizbeach, as we saw, but we have to wait till it has a mum in order to shecht it. But the question is, what about the obligation of the bailim to transfer ownership over the bechor to a kohen? That's called matnas kahuna. You know, there's a famous sugya in Bava Metzia called Takfa Kohen. Are you familiar with that? The Davav, the Shach wrote a whole book on one sugya called Tak. That's the name of the sefer that he wrote. It's called Takfa Kohen. It's almost 5 centuries ago. The Gemara says that when a bechor is born, a firstborn, peterechem to the animal, to the mother, to peterechem, the owner of the animal is obligated to give it to the kohen as one of matnas kahuna. Now we have a case of a suffix bechor. Why? Because the mother first had a nafel, I don't know how you call that, some sort of miscarriage, and we're not sure if it was viable or not viable, and therefore the next animal to be born might be a bechor, might not be a bechor. And the kohen went ahead and he grabbed it. And now we have a principle of dini mamas hamotzi mechabel baraya. So the kohen is saying, "Oh, it's definitely a bechor, and therefore it's mine." And the Yisrael is saying, "No, it's not a bechor, and it's mine." That's a very, very, very complicated and famous sugya in Bava Metzia. So what's the deal with tmuras bechor? Since we say that tmuras bechor has the kedusha of bechor, just as it's lacking the possibility of bringing it onto the mizbeach, what is its status as far as the chiyuv of a bechor as matnas kahuna to deliver it over to the bailim? And he writes here in the footnotes of Machlokes in the Rambam in Tosfos. This would be footnote number Kuf Gimel. Am I correct? He says Shitas Rambam sheni tenis l'kohanim. The Rambam gives you the simple, knee-jerk response here. Since the kedusha of the bechor is now transferred, or I shouldn't say transferred, but superimposed on the tmura, therefore it has to be given to the kohen. But Tosas Shita in Masechtas Zvachim is that ein brought din nesina of kohen for some strange reason. I guess it's according to Tosas, only kedushas mizbeach generates this din mamon of matnas kahuna, but this tmura does not have kedushas mizbeach. And he tells you to look in the Brisker Rav in Masechta Bechorah. So I'm hoping that the Brisker Rav will explain the cheat of Tosas here, because the Rambam is just intuitively correct. Okay, now we get to Korban Pesach. What's the deal with Tmuras Korban Pesach? Now you know that a Korban Pesach is brought on Erev Pesach, on the 14th of Nisan, and eaten that night of Yom Tov on the 15th of Nisan, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, until Chatzos. And now he took the Korban Pesach and he used it for a Maisa Tmura onto a Behemoth Chulin. So to what extent does that Behemoth Chulin have the status of a Korban Pesach? And it may depend upon whether or not this Maisa Tmura was done before Chatzos or after Chatzos. Now, that's according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. According to Chachamim, we give you the entire night of Tesvav b'Nisan to eat the Korban Pesach. Now, both according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and according to the Chachamim, we have what's called Pesach B'Zmano and Pesach Shalom B'Zmano. Again, there might be machlokas about when the Zman terminates, but at some point, everybody agrees that the Zman terminates. Now, the halacha of Pesach Shalom Zmano is that it's shlomim. It's stripped of all the dinim of a korban Pesach, and it now becomes a korban shlom. How that magic works, you have to learn, Masechet Pesachim for it. So Tmuras korban Pesach. Ha'im karevu atzmo kishlomim. If we say that the Tmura of a korban Pesach cannot be a korban Pesach, then we have a halacha that whatever was separated and designated as a korban Pesach but cannot be a korban Pesach falls into a default position called shlomim, and that should apply to Tmura, because the Tmuras Pesach cannot be brought as a korban Pesach. It was never separated as a korban Pesach, which has to be done on the latest on Erev Pesach. So what is the status of Tmuras Pesach? Logically, I would have said it's a shlomin, because that's always the fallback position for a korban Pesach. It can't be a Pesach, it's shlomin. Oh, sheyira ad sheyipo bomum v'yovi b'domov shlomin. Now, honestly, I don't know why that should be so. He's definitely, unquestionably agreed that it is shlomin, because any Pesach that can't be brought as a Pesach is shlomin. But can it be brought on the Mizbeach as a korban shlomin? And this is going to be a machlokes. Let's see if he tells you where it is. Oh, he doesn't. All right, so this is apparently a later machlokes, but whatever it is, one shita is, again, I always claim this is intuitively correct, and that is that it's a korban shlomin. It should have all the dinim of shlomin. Why should a Tmuras Pesach, unless it's some Zeres HaKosov, Rasha, why shouldn't it have the same status as the original korban, at least as far as shlomin is concerned? Because every korban Pesach has within it inherently a status as a korban shlomin. And in an event that it can't be brought as a korban Pesach, you bring it as a korban shlomin. But now he has another shita. No, it can't be brought on the Mizbeach as a korban shlomin. We simply have to wait until it becomes a balas mum, and then we'll be podeh. Iroi ad sheyipo b'mum, v'yavi b'domav, that means pigeon, shlomin, meaning I agree with you. The status of Tmuras Pesach is shlomin, but it can't be brought on the Mizbeach. In that sense, he's equating Pesach with Maser and Bechor. Just like we said in Maser and Bechor, there's a separate drasha that prohibits taking the Tmura of a Maser or Bechor onto the Mizbeach. The same applies to a korban Pesach. Apparently based on some sort of Gzeira Shava between Pesach and Bechor and Maser. La locha, im heimer korban Pesach kodem chatzos yom arbos, so shuzman akrovas ha-Pesach, eino karov hu v'atzmo ela doma, v'im heimer li acher chatzos hayom, hu atzmo karev shlom. Let's see if we can figure this out. The Torah commands us to be makriv the Pesach. Again, certain parts will go on the Mizbeach, certain parts will be eaten that night. Al matzos u'merom yochlu. But the chiyuv of hakrava is on the 14th at chatzos. In fact, the Gemara says that from that moment on, you're not allowed to have chametz in your possession, because the Torah says al tizvach al chametz dam zivti, that the zvicha, meaning the hakrava of a korban Pesach, has to take place at a moment when you are chametz free. You don't have any chametz in your possession, and that's chatzos hayom, midday on Erev Pesach. Again, midrabanan, we have to already start an hour or 2 hours earlier. 10 a.m., 11 a.m., whatever it might be. But on a doraisa level, the Isur Chametz emerges together with the tzvicha of the Korban Pesach at Chatzos. Now, it's Chatzos on Erev Pesach, the 14th. I have in front of me a Korban Pesach, and now I do a Maisa Tmura. That's case number one. Case number two is that it's before Chatzos, and the Zman HaKrova has not emerged yet, and I do a Maisa Tmura. And the difference is whether or not the Tmura of a Korban Pesach is brought as a Korban Shlomim. If you're talking about a Tmura that was done at the moment in which there's Hakrova, so what I have in front of me is a Korban Pesach, of course a Beimas Chulid, but a Korban Pesach, at the time of its Hakrova. And therefore the Tmura effectuates a Din Hakrova onto the Tmura, because I'm taking the Din Hakrova of the Korban Pesach, the original, and cloning it onto the Tmura, onto the Beimas Chulid. And now it becomes Shlomim. Because as we said, whenever you have a Korban Pesach that cannot be brought as a Pesach, it defaults into a mode of Shlomim. And there's no reason why we shouldn't take the Din HaKrova of the original, which was Korban Pesach, and superimpose it on the facsimile, meaning what does he call it, the substitute, as a Korban Shlomim. Again, it can't be a Korban Pesach, but it sort of extracts the status of Shlomim from the Korban Pesach, because every Korban Pesach has within it, inherently within it, in the, behind the scenes, underneath the surface, it has the status of a Shlomim. And whatever Korban Pesach cannot be brought as a Pesach will be brought as a Shlomim. And now he's doing a Tmura on the Shlomim onto the Beimas Chulin. But if he does this Maisa Tmura before Chatzos on Erev Pesach, when the carbon is not Omeid Lizvicha, he can't be Makar Korban Pesach before Chatzos on the 14th. If you do so, it's possible. Therefore, you cannot, through Tmura, clone a Kedushas Mizbeach of Shlomim onto the Tmura. And therefore, you have no choice but Yira Achi Stop. You have to wait until it becomes a Baum. So therefore, Mehemir Liachar Chatzos Hayom Hu Atzmo Korif Shlomim. And that's based on the final conclusion. Because again, we mentioned at the beginning of this discussion that there's machlokes with regard to whether or not Tmuras Korban Pesach is to be equated with Bechar Maaseh, where the Tmura is not brought on. So we're assuming now, La'alocha, that a Tmuras Pesach, in contrast with Tmuras Bechar and Maaseh, is brought on the Mizbeach. But we're qualifying it. We can only draw that conclusion, the halacha rule, that we can bring the Tmuras Korban Pesach as a Shlomim on the Mizbeach if the Tmura was done after Chatzos on Erev Pesach, when the original, meaning the Korban Pesach, was Omeid Lahakrov, Al Gabi Mizbeach. Okay then, let's just see how we're doing. All right, let's just see if we can very, very quickly fit in another short paragraph. Heimir al behemas chulin balas mum. Arei din behemas zu ki behemas hegdish shekodam hekdesha es muma. Let's see. I think I have to turn this the other way. Read the footnote. Where are we up to? Kuf Hey? Kuf Vav. So what's in Kuf Hey? We didn't see Kuf Hey. V'vur b'psachim sheyesh tmuras Pesach hakreva v'yesh she'eno kreva. Emasai kreva v'emasai ema kreva. Im himir b'korban Pesach atzmo leon kreva. Oh, this is the case where I told you it's a Shlomim. But Hufresh Acher Tachtov Eino Krev. Then the Tmur is not Krev. Because again, once he's mafrich a substitute for the original carbon pesach, then the original carbon pesach is no longer karev al gabi mizbech as such as a carbon pesach. It might be brought on the mizbech as a shlavim, but it's no longer. He was meimir a carbon pesach. So therefore, the tmura of a carbon pesach, in a case where he lost the carbon pesach and then he found it, but in the meantime he had designated a substitute carbon pesach, that tmura would be excluded from his bed. Okay, then. So let's just make a note of what we got up to. So tomorrow, again, I just want to reiterate, we will start at 11:20. Okay, then?